All right, we're now going to talk about the Texas Legislature, which for Texas, we're what's called a bicameral um, House or bicameral system, legislative system. Bicameral means there's two houses, whereas a unicameral would actually be one house. There's only one state that actually has a unicameral system, and that's Nebraska. Um, Texas has, like I said, a bicameral. So we have both a Senate and a House of Representatives, kind of the same thing that we have in our federal government. The numbers of senators and House of Representatives obviously are a lot different because the state's a lot smaller than the larger country. So for the Senate, we have 31 senators, and it's been that way for a little while. And we also have 150 House of Representative members. So let's talk about some of the requirements to actually become one of those. If you wanted to become a member of the state house, you need to be 21 years old, lived in the state for 2 years, and 12 months in the specific district that you're trying to represent, the one that you're running for. For the Texas State Senate, you need to be 26 years old, and you need to be a Texas resident for 5 years. And again, the same thing, 12 months within the district that you're running for. Unlike the federal government, where if you were a senator, you just need to be a member of somewhere in that state. For the for the Senate, the Texas Senate, you have to actually be in a district that you're actually running from in order to actually run for the Senate. The way the Texas congressional system actually works is we work on what's called biennial sessions, which is every 2 years. They have sessions, and they last for 140 days. And they have these sessions in odd number of years. So if it was 1999, we would have a session. If it was 2001, we would have a session. If it's 2000, we would not have a session because it would not actually be an odd number of years, if that makes sense. What does happen every now and then, or actually a little more often than you would think, is the governor can actually call for special sessions. Nobody else can. And so if the governor calls for a special session, usually he or she, but whoever the governor is at that particular time, can call for a special session. But usually that session has to be geared towards some particular topic that the governor is actually calling for. The interesting thing about that, though, however, is once it's in session, the amount of legislation that they can actually put together during that period of time can be massive. So keep that in mind. Now, the limitations of the session that a governor can call can only last 30 days. And so beyond that, they're not allowed to call a session for any longer. So literally, you can't have a governor decide, okay, I'm just going to keep Congress in session forever. They can't. They can only do it for 30 days at a time. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that are important to the ideas of the state Congress itself, or the state legislature itself. We have a couple of ways of actually getting the members there. One thing we have is called reapportionment, which is the process of allocating representatives to districts. Then we have redistricting, which is after a census, they go through and they decide, okay, the lines of people, representing different districts need to change. And so what they'll do is they'll put forth a list of the new numbers of people for each district and kind of divide it that way. And quite often this leads to something called gerrymandering. And if you're not familiar with the term, that means basically they're taking advantage of the system, because these limitations are put in by whoever's actually controlling the house at that particular time. They make their decision, and quite often they will do it based on whichever party happens to be overly represented at that particular time. Right now we have, most of the time actually with Texas, we have one party usually in charge, usually in massive charge of the House and the Senate. And that's been no different for quite a while. So usually that leads to a bunch of legal challenges, and the court system has to actually deal with it to see if it's actually being fair, because gerrymandering is not supposed to be something that people are actually doing, because basically that creates an unfair advantage to one party over the other. So they'll get challenged in the court system. And if it survives the court system, then that's the way it's going to be for the next, election. And if it doesn't make it through the challenge, then basically they have to redistrict and kind of do the whole thing over again. We do not have term limits for our Texas legislature in Texas. Some states do, because it's the idea that if you set up term limits, you can get different people serving in government. The idea of putting term limits in Texas has never really been a very popular idea, and it's never actually gone far. And the main reason for that is there is quite a bit of turnover within the Texas government. So we don't have a lot of long serving people. We have a few of them, but generally not so many as you tend to have on the federal government. So like I said, there are no term limits for the Texas legislature. So term limits being, again, the number of times a person can be elected, to the same office in the state. So let's talk about some of the important positions within the Texas legislature. We have what's called a Speaker of the House, and this is somebody that gets elected by basically the entire House to be their representative. And this person has a couple of important functions. And this happens every time there's a new session. And so because of the way the House is with the changeover that they tend to have, and a tendency not to keep the same person in charge all the time, there is a lot of changeover when it comes to every new session of the legislature. They tend to grab somebody new. Usually if somebody stays, they usually stay for 1 or 2 terms, and generally don't stay that much longer. But again, it's because of the vote of the actual session itself of the House, if they have to decide whether or not they want to keep the same person that they had from the very beginning. But there are 5 main functions that the Speaker of the House actually takes care of, such as number 1, he or she appoints all the chairs of all of the different committees. And these are the ones that, make all the laws. Because you got to remember, the important thing about your legislative committee, let me rephrase that, about your legislature is it makes all of your laws. The way our system is set up, at least in the United States and the Texas state itself, is if you want new laws, they're made by your legislature. And then we'll talk about the process of how laws actually or bills actually become laws. So number 2 is the Speaker of the House also appoints most members of each standing committee. Number 3 appoints members of the calendar and procedural committees. So a lot of appointments going to different committees. Also serves, number 4, serves as the presiding officer over all sessions. And number 5, refers all bills to committees. Now, all of these, if you think about it, are really important because there's nothing that gets done. There's no bill that goes towards becoming a law without the Speaker of the House's, permission. And so that's a very, very powerful position. Now, in the Senate, they have a very similar structure, and it's kind of like our national Senate, to where rather than having an actual person like a Speaker of the House who's from the members of the Senate, it's whoever the executive person is in charge. Well, in the Senate for the state, the lieutenant governor of the state is the person who actually becomes kind of like the Speaker of the House of the Senate. They're not called that, but basically has the same functions. And so those same five, appoints chairs of all committees, appoints most members of each standing committee, appoints the members of the calendar and procedural committees, serves as presiding officer over all sessions, and refers all bills to committees. That's all done by the lieutenant governor. The one big important distinction between the two is the lieutenant governor basically serves, with the permission of the Senate itself, because the Senate can take away that power. Unlike our federal government, where your vice president presides over your Senate, and that's constitutionally, the Senate power in the Texas government is given by decision of the Senate itself. So they can take away that power at any time. They haven't really done that, but they have threatened it before, because certain circumstances where disagreements between parties, it can happen. But mostly the lieutenant governor has been represented by the party that's in the Senate anyway, or leading the Senate anyway. So there's generally not been too much of a problem unless it's individual, and those kinds of problems do happen from time to time. Now, one second. I have a really hard time with my throat. Okay, so let's talk about how bills become a law. Almost the same way as our federal government, your legislative, goes through the committees. And like I said, Speaker of the House decides what's going to actually be decided on going further. And then basically your legislation decides on it. So you have to have both the House and the Senate approve something. So they have to pass both chambers, and then it goes to the governor, and the governor has 10 days to actually sign it. And if he or she doesn't sign it, it basically gets vetoed. Or he or she can actually veto it right there, right then and there. And so basically the different kinds of things that lawmaking takes care of in the Texas Senate is bills that become laws or could become laws, resolutions, the budget and taxation, which is really important because all money having anything to do with the state within government has to go through the legislative department. They also handle oversight. So looking at different committees in the executive department and other things, they usually don't have too much of a role in that because, like I said before, the legislature tends to be the same party as the executive department or the members of the executive department. And it's only when you start to have party flips that you would actually see a lot of more of the oversight start to take place, because you'd have another party looking after a lot of the things that are actually going on. Or if there's somebody controversial who's actually in charge doing things that gets questioned, then you might actually have more oversight. They also have the power of impeachment, although it has rarely been used. As a matter of fact, in the state of Texas, it's only been used twice. So that's basically the background of the legislative department. And so keep in mind, there's a lot more nitty gritty details. The book covers quite a bit of it, and so does the PowerPoints. As long as you're up to speed on that, you should be pretty much fine. I'm not going to get into the specific of the exact names of the people who are actually in charge, because that changes almost every year or every legislative term. So I'm not as tied to whoever is the name of the person in charge at any specific time, because they're just names, they're just people. And while they're important at the time, what's more important is to understand the actual positions themselves and the importance of those positions and their ties to the Constitution and to the way the government actually works. So with that, I'm going to leave it at that. And that's all I have for this time.